and begin this shir by thanking our sponsors. Our sponsors for today's shiur are, first of all, we'd like to thank Shirley Zuck and family, who are sponsoring to commemorate the yahrzeit of their husband and father, Dr. Jocelyn Zuck, Yeshua ben Yehonatan Zechrona Livracha, and also for Shirley's brother, Moshe Leibish ben Yechiel Chaim Soberman. So first of all, I remember Dr. Zuck very, very well, and we don't forget the cavity, the last cavity he filled, if some of you do remember. But may the neshama benefit from the words of Torah that we study here tonight. So thank you, Shirley. And thank you, Zuck family, for the sponsorship. The neshamos indeed should benefit. We would also like to thank Feige Libman, who is sponsoring the lecture as well to commemorate the yahrzeit number 76 of her father, Philip Schmidt, Feivel ben Yechezkel, a man of Kovna, owned books in a bookstore in Kovna. So may indeed the neshama benefit from our words of Torah. And we thank you very much for this sponsorship. Today's shir is about a rabbi. His name is Rabbi Akiva Eiger. Many of us have heard of him. And the question is really, why did I choose specifically this rabbi? Why did I choose Rabbi Akiva Eiger? There are so many incredible rabbis throughout the ages. Authors, writers, religious thinkers, righteous people. Why specifically did I choose to give an evening to Rabbi Akiva Eiger? So perhaps all great rabbis really deserve such an evening where we could review a little bit about their life, their achievements, talk a little bit about their Torah. But there's a reason why I chose Rabbi Akiva Eiger. But to begin to appreciate it, I would have to go back to age 13. You know that the Talmud is called Yam HaTalmud. It's like a sea. It's like a sea because it's vast, it's deep, and if you don't know how to swim, or if you don't have the proper vessel to protect yourself, you could drown, lo aleinu. And so when it comes to the Talmud, a successful Talmudic journey needs, number one, an appreciation and a respect to the Talmud. You got to respect the ocean before you make your way into the ocean, right? You can't go ahead and consider the ocean like a little pond and go with your little kayak that you have up there in cottage country. You have to respect the ocean, and so too you have to respect the Talmud. But what I feel, and this was something that I was clearly missing at age 13 when I entered into yeshiva, was some kind of orientation. In other words, when you study Talmudic literature, you study rabbis of the Mishnah, and you study rabbis of the Talmud, and then you start mentioning early authorities and later authorities. But what I do recall at age 13, all these names being blended together, and I have no doubt that I was not the only one that would be hearing a name of a rabbi from the early 20th century and hear a name of a Talmudic authority from the early 4th century and not being confident who lived first, meaning I would just blend these names together. There was no guidance. There was nothing that provided some historical context. All that was lacking, and I really feel that there was a lack of orientation from my early days in that journey of the Talmud. Obviously, with time, you develop a little bit of an understanding and a little bit of insight. And suddenly, when it becomes organized, there's a much deeper level of appreciation of your Talmudic journey. And when I teach a little bit, I always try to place things in perspective. In other words, you want to know when the individual lived, who he's quoting, what influenced him, and what did he in turn influence. You want to put everything in historical context because suddenly there's an appreciation and a deeper understanding And also, if we are a faith that focuses so much on linking our daily practices to Sinai, we have to be familiar with all the links, right? So it is so important that Talmudic literature and the Talmudic journey comes with an appreciation of the era, the history, and when a name is mentioned, place the individual. And I mentioned that specifically as an introduction to Rabbi Akiva Eiger, because I have no doubt that there is not 10 minutes that go by that the words of Rabbi Akiva Eiger are not quoted somewhere in the world, and perhaps it's 10 seconds even, because his influence on Talmudic literature was so great that it is impossible to really study Talmud and not hear insights, right, or questions from Rabbi Akiva Eiger, recognized as a great Gaon. And that's why I chose this individual. And obviously there's going to be some more information and more details that are quite relevant to appreciate him. But there's one additional thing that Rabbi Akiva Eiger teaches the young Talmudic student that is extremely important. Rabbi Akiva Eiger was known as the one who asks incredible questions, but does not always provide the answers. Often, quite often, questions asked by Rabbi Akiva Eiger would end off with a tzarich iyun. In other words, this topic, this question indicates that we still have to analyze the text, meaning I'm leaving this open. It's an open case. I don't have a clear answer. I can't settle the issue. And the young student develops at a very early stage an appreciation for the fact that it is possible to study Talmudic literature, have a question, and live with that question. Meaning not everything collapses due to a question. And perhaps there's some guidance, not just that relates to our study of Judaism, but perhaps it's guidance for life, that we live sometimes with questions, some serious questions, right? Why do the righteous suffer? Why does such an individual have to go through that difficulty? We have a lot of questions that remain with a tzarich iyun. It still requires analysis, meaning there's no clear understanding. Rabbi Akiva Eiger goes often together with tzarich iyun. So there's a lesson there. And before we begin his the actual journey of Rabbi Akiva Eiger, there's something very exciting that relates to a specific portrait. And it works as follows. Here we go. What you see here, if you do see it, is a Shvacha Maise copy, a very Shvacha copy of a portrait made, I think, in the 1840s by an artist by the name of Julius Knorr. And this portrait is known as Der Marktplatz von Posen. Der Marktplatz von Posen. I'll translate that. The marketplace of Posen. There was a city in West Prussia by the name of Posen or Poznan. It was the region, Posen was within that area that during a period of time was German, but during a different period of time was Polish. And therefore it has two names, Poznan or Posen. For the Germans, it's Posen. At the time, there was no Germany. Germany only came to existence in 1871, but in Prussia, the city was known as Posen. So this Julius Knorr goes ahead and provides for us a portrait of the Marktplatz. In it, you can't see it quite clearly in this specific portrait, but right around here, if you look carefully, there are three heads. And those three heads are actually of three rabbis. And if you see it here a little bit better, we'll go ahead and provide a drawing of the three heads. Here were the three heads. Right here in the middle is Rabbi Akiva Eiger. In other words, Julius Nor, who is not Jewish, wants to give us a feeling, a taste of the marketplace, of the Marktplatz of Posen. So he decides to draw or to paint different personalities that you would find there. And it appears that many of them were actually well-known locals, right? He adds to the portrait three rabbis, one in the middle, two leading this elderly rabbi. The elderly rabbi is Rabbi Akiva Eiger. The benefit that we gain from this portrait is, believe it or not, a clear picture of how he looked. As you know, for us Torah Jews, there's a level of excitement of seeing a portrait or a picture of a Torah leader. You know, there's the concept of Hayu Einecha Ro'ot et Morecha, that when your eyes look at a great person, you are inspired by it. Now, we've emphasized a little bit too much on these portraits, and as a result, a significant percentage of pictures or drawings that you would see of great rabbis have nothing to do with the great rabbis. So, for example, when the state of Israel, some 30 years ago, decided to put the Rambam on specific bills, there is nothing, it has nothing to do with the Rambam. It was a nice looking individual, no question about it. The Israelis placed on their, I don't know, was it 10 shekel bill, but it was not the Rambam. We don't know how the Rambam looked, right? There were no photographs and no drawings. Only in the 17th century do we start finding some portraits. And as we move on, we find more and more of accurate portraits of great rabbis. But this Marktplatz of Poznan actually provides for us how the Rabbi Akiva Eiger looked. And therefore, when there are other portraits that circulated, we are quite confident how he looked. But there's something symbolic there as well. Something very, very symbolic. As we will see soon, Rabbi Akiva Eiger was considered a tremendous gaon, a brilliant mind. From a very young age, his parents recognized that he does not forget anything. And his ability to analyze text and address issues with clarity was incredible. He was a gaon. But what's special about him is the fact that he was not a gaon that separated himself from society. He was not a gaon that sat in a library or perhaps in his own room, detached from others studying text. He was a very involved rabbi. That's what we're going to see. Extremely involved. And therefore, for me, it seems quite appropriate that the portrait that really identifies Rabbi Akiva Eiger for us is one of a rabbi in the marketplace, symbolizing the idea he interacted with society, right? Not in the ivory tower. So therefore, there's a level of importance in this portrait. And I think now it's an opportunity to start a little bit about the actual life of Rabbi Akiva Eiger. So here we go. Rabbi Akiva Eiger was born Akiva, but his father's last name was actually Gins. Akiva Gins. He was known as Akiva, the son of Moshe Gins. He was born in Eisenstadt, which was considered one of the significant communities in Hungary. Today it's Austria. And born at a young age, had significant yichus, especially on his mother's side. And his mother, Gittel, decided that she's going to name this son Akiva after her father. Her father passed away at a very young age. He was a great Torah scholar. He was called the first Rabbi Akiva Eiger. And she, the mother, named the child Akiva after her father. And perhaps as a result of that, Rabbi Akiva is not known to the Jewish world as Rabbi Akiva Gins, but rather as Rabbi Akiva Eiger. He took his mother's side name. It could be out of respect to the grandfather because he was named after his maternal grandfather. Some argue that the yichus of the Eiger family was so great that it was more practical to use. Not clear, but even though there are documents that he signed Akiva Gins, the fact is he's known to us as Rabbi Akiva Eiger. Now, his early years are ones that already as a young boy, at age 11 or 12, there was a fight between yeshivos. Who's going to get the young man? Would it be the yeshiva in Breslau? Will it be the yeshiva in Mattisdorf? He spent time in both yeshivot and recognized as a brilliant Torah scholar, worthy of being supported for an extended period of time where he could focus on his limud Torah. So he was obviously offered a very wealthy and honorable shidduch. So in 1781, he was offered to marry the daughter of Rabbi Isaac Margalit or Margaliot. He was a wealthy, very wealthy individual in a city called Lisa. Lisa, if you call it when it was German. Other times when the region there was controlled by the Polish, it was known as Leszno. Leszno. In our tradition, we call it Lisa. Lisa. So often, by the way, many, if not all of the cities we're going to be talking about today are in that area that are between Germany and Poland, that were part of Germany, and of course, after World War II, become part of Poland, but share two names, the Polish name and the German name. It's all basically Prussia. So in 1781, the 20-year-old Akiva Eiger settles in Leszno and is supported by a father-in-law, and he had no interest in the rabbinate. He did have an interest in teaching Torah. So therefore, there were students that came to learn from him personally. So he had a little yeshiva in Leszno and Lisa, where he taught Torah, and he did not have to worry at all about his financial status. He was supported with comfort, and this was a Glickel. Glickel, his wife, was accustomed most probably to some level of comforts that she was able to continue getting. So life seemed to be good for him physically and spiritually as well. But life, sometimes, things occur that give us a little bit of a twist. There was a shreklech of fire, a terrible fire in Lisa. I don't know exactly what year this is taking place, but it's in the 1780s. And the fire devastated the city, but more than that, it devastated Mr. Isaac or Reb Isaac Margalit's financial being. In other words, all of his investments or the real estate that he owned, whatever he was involved with financially, took a very significant hit, to such an extent that he was no longer able to support his son-in-law. So this is a new era for Akiva Eiger. He has to start thinking of a way to support his family, and he had to find a rabbinate. He was not too excited. He didn't do this with enthusiasm, but he felt this is the right thing to do. Clearly one that can make a tremendous contribution. In those days, it was a given. It was a given that if you are a rabbi of a town and you're a Talmid Chacham, part of your salary would be that the community would commit to support Talmidim, students. In other words, in some contracts, you find that the city is doing well, and therefore they're able to support 20 students. In other contracts, it could be 6 or 7 students. So Rabbi Akiva Eiger, moving into the rabbinate, yes, it placed upon him the responsibility of the rabbinate to be sure that the shochtim are doing the right job, to be sure that the mikvos are kosher, to answer questions, to deal with the needs of the poor, as we'll see. But also he continued as a Rosh Yeshiva. He still taught his students. Now, this was a very practical way of learning Torah. In other words, this was not a yeshiva that's detached from a community, as you find them in the 20th and the 21st century. This is a yeshiva that the issues he would discuss with his students were one that related to issues that he heard in the morning. If there was a specific woman that came from a poor household and had a question about the pot, and he felt that he should be lenient because, you're dealing here with a person that's an ani, that's poor. So therefore, when he would discuss in the afternoon with his students the halachic issues, they understood very well that guidance is not given based on ideals. Guidance is provided based on realities. And sometimes you have to be more lenient. Other times you could be more strict, perhaps. But it was a very healthy system of transmitting to the next generation of Torah scholars and understanding how a rabbi functions. The first community he becomes a rabbi of is in a town called Markish Friedland in German, or for the Polish, it was Mirosławice. Again, the same region. And here he is, a Rav, guiding the community, and he had many good attributes as a rabbi, concerned for the welfare of all people, but at the same time, his analysis of Talmud and Halacha was in such depth that it was studied, not just in his days already in the yeshivot, but this continued into the 21st century, as we'll see soon. But before we get more into his rabbinic career, he suffered a tremendous tragedy in the year 1796. He already married off a few children at the time, but Nebuch, his wife Glickl, passed away. And it appears that he was a very emotional person. Rabbi Akiva Eiger was very emotional because we have his letters where he responded to someone after they suggested a shidduch a few months after the passing. Okay, they suggested for Rabbi Akiva Eiger a new wife several months after the passing of Glickl, and it could be, it's not even clear, it could be it was several weeks. But Rabbi Akiva Eiger responds, I think this is absurd that you're mentioning a shidduch at this point. And he notes, Emaher lasot shidduch, you think that I could just jump into making a new shidduch when I'm still in mourning? Ha'im eshkach, do you think that I could ever forget ahavat eshet nurim? How can I ever forget, my loved one from youth? I'll never forget her. And he expresses his emotion. He expresses his deep, deep emotion that he felt towards his wife. He does eventually remarry, but just an interesting chapter and a very fascinating individual. I mentioned the fact that his entry into the rabbinate was not made out of choice, but circumstances forced it upon him. And you find in his letter where he cries out that my dream would be limtso manoach, my greatest dream would be to find some kind of calm environment where I could be porek ol harabanut, where I could unload the yoke of the rabbinate. Veleshev, my dream would be to sit ke'echad hamonim, to just be an average Jew. That was his desire. Now, when he said he wants to be an average Jew, it doesn't mean to act like an average Jew. He wanted to commit himself completely to Torah study and obviously to continue educating students, but the responsibilities of the rabbinate simply overwhelmed him. And he took it very, very seriously. Rabbi Akiva Eiger was known as putting a tremendous amount of effort into Bikur Cholim. And when he was in Marakash Fernan, in his first rabbinic position that he held for 24 years, he made it his business to visit every single chola in the community. So this was a person that took it very, very seriously, but understood very well, this is a yoke. Now, Rabbi Akiva Eiger, his daughter, I think it was his third daughter, his name was Sarah Cyril or Sarah. And Sarah was a very special young woman. Unfortunately, she was like 22 or 23 when she lost her husband. So this was quite devastating again for Rabbi Akiva Eiger, that his daughter now is suffering as an almona. But due to the fact that she had an incredible reputation and personality and her role as a leader, So he started sending letters out to different rabbis if they know of anyone in their community that would be worthy and appropriate for Cyril. One of the letters he sent out reached Rabbi Moshe Sofer. Rabbi Moshe Sofer, who was in Preshburg, known today as Bratislava. And Rabbi Moshe Sofer opens the letter. And this was a few months after Rabbi Moshe Sofer's wife passed away. And she passed away and he had no children. He was already in his early 40s at the time. So as he opens the letter, he handed it over to one of his shamoshim and said, you know what, look into this young lady. Look into this young lady. And this shamish became the shadchan. And Rabbi Moshe Sofer, the Chassam Sofer, married the daughter of Rabbi Akiva Eiger. And I think it was close to 2 decades, the gap between them in age. She was in her early 20s. He was just turned 40 or something like that. And they had many children together. What's interesting here is that the age difference between the Chassam Sofer and Rabbi Akiva Eiger was about a year, perhaps a year and a half, meaning Chassam Sofer was a year and a half younger than his father-in-law. Now, they already knew one another. They both were the Gaonim, the great rabbinic figures in Europe at the time, excluding Lithuania. They were the great rabbinic figures. And therefore, they were in communication, and the relationship was very, very good. But it appears that when it comes to influence, the son-in-law had more influence than the father-in-law. I don't know exactly why. It appears that Chassam Sofer had more influence than his father-in-law, Rabbi Akiva Eiger. And this became relevant because as Rabbi Akiva Eiger grew in reputation, there was an understanding that he is worthy of a larger community, and a larger community would give him far more opportunity to be more influential. But he didn't have perhaps the connections that were needed for such a position. His son-in-law helped him. And eventually in 1814, he becomes Rabbi Akiva Eiger. After 24 years in his first position, he becomes the rabbi of Poznan. Posen. I know myself a little bit. I'm a descendant of some Posen Jews because from my mother's father's mother's side, she was a Jacobi, and her mother's maiden name was Simon, and they were Posen Jews. So Poznan, 1814, merits to have Rabbi Akiva Eiger. And I think it's always interesting that that his son-in-law was the one that had an impact. On the side, the Sofer family, the descendants of the Chassam Sofer, it's a very large, very, very large family. Many of them, are thousands of them throughout the Jewish world. And they are extremely proud of their Sofer heritage, to such an extent that I know from my uncle in Israel, in other words, my father's sister's husband, Shlomo, Uncle Shlomo, he is a Sofer. He is a great, great grandson of Chassam Sofer. And they are extremely knowledgeable. The Sofers himself and my cousins as well, the Sofers, they are extremely knowledgeable in every branch of the Sofer family. And it is quite incredible because I one time was visiting him in Israel some 15 years ago. And I mentioned that there's someone in Memphis that is a descendant of the Chassam Sofer, and his eyes opened up. Tell me exactly from who? I didn't get all those details. So you're going to call me, or I had to inform him that next time I was in contact with him, he wanted to know exactly from which child, from which grandchild. So the Sofers are very, very much into their Sofer connection. And it was always surprising for me, and I still don't have a clear answer, why they don't take the same level of pride from the fact that they are also descendants of Rabbi Akiva Eiger. All the Sofer children were from Cyril. Cyril was the daughter of Rabbi Akiva Eiger. And it was always interesting that they place far more emphasis on the Chatam Sofer than Rabbi Akiva Eiger. And especially this was more confusing for me as a yeshiva student, because in yeshiva, you hear much, 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 much more about Rabbi Akiva Eiger and his questions than Chatam Sofer. As I entered into the, into halachic text, obviously Chatam Sofer becomes very significant. But as I'm studying Talmud in yeshiva, it was more about Rabbi Akiva Eiger. So it was something that's a little bit of a mystery. Perhaps it could be that Chatam Sofer's influence on Hungary remained intact from the days of the Chatam Sofer until this day. On the other hand, Rabbi Akiva Eiger, where he is in Germany, and the decline, the spiritual decline in Germany, it was such that his disciples did not really change Germany. When you talk about German Orthodoxy, I'm sure you would think first of Reb Shamshin Raphael Hirsch. You would think of Reb Azriel Hildesheimer. You most probably would not place Rabbi Akiva Eiger as one that guided, influenced German Jewry. Perhaps that could give a little bit of an explanation to the mystery that I have regarding the family. But it's sometimes good. The son-in-law did kick in, and he arrives in Poznan. And he was a very, very significant rabbi in Poznan. And his involvement was incredible. And we'll study a little bit about his involvement. And we'll start off with the cholera outbreak of 1831. I think it was 1831. There's a pandemic in the world. Can you imagine that? There was a pandemic in 1831. And what's happening is that unfortunately this was one that was killing many, many people. Rabbi Akiva Eiger decides that he's going to roll up his sleeves and get involved in saving lives. And we have letters from Rabbi Akiva Eiger where he gives guidance how, number one, that we have to social distance, he talks about. He talks about the fact that minyanim should not have more than 15 people, and therefore there's going to be rotations. There are letters from 1831 where he talks about what they're going to be doing for Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, that they're going to label every seat in shul with number 1, number 2 in that order, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. And then they're going to have a lottery. If your designated seat is number 1, it means you could come to shul Rosh Hashanah, not Yom Kippur. If your designated seat is number 2, you come Yom Kippur, not Rosh Hashanah. And then those who can't come to shul, there'll be minyanim in houses with guidance and with limitations, meaning he took complete control of the situation. This is a question I have, which I'm a little bit afraid to bring up. And it has to do with the fact, why is it that at times Orthodox and Torah Jews don't emphasize enough the importance of our health? In other words, why is it that from other rabbinic figures, we did not hear such guidance during pandemics? Right? Why is it, in other words, if I tell you that Rabbi Akiva Eiger got extremely involved, that indicates that in 1831, where Europe is blessed with dozens upon dozens of incredible rabbis, we don't have such records regarding most rabbis. We know about Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, but the vast majority were not as proactive as Rabbi Akiva Eiger. So why is it that at times when there's a pandemic and there are things that could be done to save lives, why is it that the teachers of Torah, who Torah teaches us v'chayvayim, the biggest mitzvah's life, why was there not enough emphasis? This is a question that is asked, and something I've thought through over a period of time. It could be that human nature is such that it is very hard to emphasize more than one thing. In other words, if I'm a spiritual being and I believe that everything is from God, And I do believe that self-improvement is important during a time of crisis, which we should all believe, because Maimonides says so, that when there is a crisis, it's a time to go ahead and improve and to figure out a way to become closer to our Creator. Sometimes when we emphasize on that, something got to give. So maybe that's an explanation. Obviously, it does not justify it. And obviously, I have every right to be inspired by Rabbi Akiva Eiger, that Rabbi Akiva Eiger talks about distancing. And he does some medical research at the time. And he finds out, for example, that the doctors do recommend that a person should not be hungry at any time. And he ordered people on Rosh Hashanah that don't dare come to shul without a breakfast. He also highly recommended that you eat mustard seeds. And therefore, this is research you could do on your own, that to go ahead and combat the spreading of cholera, mustard seeds is what they considered healthy at the time, obviously based on the medical information that they had in 1831. But his involvement was extremely significant, and something perhaps to inspire us in all eras, especially during what we are facing. He also talks about disinfecting your house. And if it's important, what he writes, that it's very important to have a very strong vinegar to disinfect all surfaces. Just very interesting what he's writing in 1831. Now, to get across this idea, Rabbi Akiva Eiger, as mentioned, was a rabbi of the marketplace, involved with people, concerned for people. During his first 24 years, right, in Marrakesh, Friedland, he did Bikur Cholim to every single chola. In Poznan, he couldn't do it anymore. The community was too big. So he hired shlichim, messengers, who would do it and would report to him. And there's a very interesting story about a wealthy person in Poznan by the name of Shlomo Binyamin Lach. Lamed, Aleph, Tet, Tzadi, Lach. So we're going to talk about Mr. Shlomo Binyamin Lach. Shlomo Binyamin Lach was a Torah Jew, successful businessman. He was an older man. He was in the hospital. And Rabbi Akiva Eiger decides to go ahead and visit him. They had a very close relationship. Rabbi Akiva Eiger walks in and he sees that Shlomo Binyamin becomes very emotional as the great rabbi walked in, and Shlomo Binyamin Lach is crying. So Rabbi Akiva Eiger asks him, tell me, what's the issue? So Shlomo Binyamin tells him the following, that I just spoke to an expert doctor, and he says that there's a specific type of food that I need to eat to get me back on track. So Rabbi Akiva Eiger says, that's great, so go ahead and do it. But Shlomo Binyamin says, it's not kosher. And he started crying. So Rabbi Akiva Eiger thinks for a second, and he says to Shlomo Binyamin, don't eat it. Don't eat it. So Shlomo Binyamin was calmed down, because suddenly, number one, he was struggling with the issue, right? He was knowledgeable. He knew that halachically you're supposed to eat it. On the other hand, he felt terrible to eat something not kosher. And here the rabbi just told him, and not just an average rabbi, the Gaon, Rabbi Akiva Eiger, told him not to eat it. It settled the issue for him. And he was extremely happy and satisfied. Rabbi Akiva Eiger walks out of the room, says goodbye to him, goes to the kitchen, and tells the kitchen staff, listen here, you are going to prepare the food that the doctor recommended, make it in a way, conceal it, that he shouldn't notice what it is, and tell him it's kosher. And that's what they did. So the brilliance, obviously, of a man that knows halachically, of course he's supposed to eat it. But for a person whose whole life who kept kosher, it would be too painful. So here he was able to work it out completely, that he got the food, and it actually gave him several months of good health for Shlomo Binyamin Lach. But at the same time, he didn't have to know that he's eating something not kosher. That's the story of Rabbi Akiva Eiger. After Shlomo Binyamin passed away a few years later, he left. His commitment to Rabbi Akiva Eiger that was such that he left him 6,000 ruble tal, in other words, some kind of currency. I don't know the exact way of assessing how much it was, but he left a substantial gift for Rabbi Akiva Eiger to build a Jewish hospital. And for Rabbi Akiva Eiger, this was incredible because that's what he wanted. So they established in Poznan a hospital that would treat every single Jewish person with very high standards of the time. The charge was minimal, and if a person was poor, they would not charge at all. And Rabbi Akiva Eiger took complete control of the hospital. There was an issue there because there was a kehillah at the time, and the kehillah had a deep desire to take control of it. But Rabbi Akiva Eiger felt that he could do a better job, and he was concerned that the community would go ahead and raise the price and not have the standards he wanted. There was actually a big fight in Poznan, but Rabbi Akiva Eiger, after government officials walked through the hospital and commended him for the high standards, he kept control, and it remained a hospital until eventually it turned into an old age home in Poznan that was there for many, many, many decades. Very interesting story. A rabbi involved in what is taking place there. Among the controversies of that Rabbi Akiva Eiger had to address had to do with the fight between the printing houses. We've discussed in the past a little bit about the history of the printing of the Talmud. And this is also something that, for me, was always fascinating because, you sit in yeshiva with the Talmud in front of you, and it's not part of the orientation to tell you a little bit about the history, how it transferred from manuscript to the movable typeset. So when later on I started reading and studying about it, it was fascinating for me. And one of the fascinating events, which many of you are familiar with from earlier discussions, had to do with the fact that in the early years of the printing of the Talmud, there was an understanding that a person would not invest heavily in the printing unless he would have a guarantee that the market would be his for an extended period of time. In other words, if let's say I decide at some point I'm living in Amsterdam, the year is 1750, and I want to go ahead and print the Talmud. Now, to print the Talmud, I have to purchase the equipment, purchase the paper, purchase or hire workers. There's a tremendous investment, and to go ahead and return, right, to get your returns, you would have to wait perhaps a decade or two. And the biggest concern for a person considering such an investment is, what if I print my Talmud, invest all that money, but a year later, someone else goes ahead and prints it and does a little bit of a better job. No one's going to buy mine. I'm destroyed. I'm finished. So therefore, they worked out a system where rabbis would guarantee to the printers that no one is going to be purchasing or printing any other Talmud because you were given the rights. So rabbis would hold on to rights and would give it to a printer that for the next 15 and in some cases 20 years, and even in some cases 25 years, no one has the rights to print the Talmud. So that's really the origin of haskamot. When you find approbations in the beginning of a text, in the beginning of a book, the idea in its original form was to protect the printer, but really by protecting the printer, you're protecting Klal Yisrael, because otherwise no one's going to print a Talmud, no one's going to print the Talmud. It's too much of a gamble. So in 1807, around 1807, there was a Hasidic family, a very honorable Hasidic family, the Shapiros, descendants of Rav Pinchas of Kuritz, and they decided to print the Talmud in a city called Slawicia in Poland, and they were given the rights to print the Talmud for the next 20 or 25 years. It depends what rabbi you ask, but the Slawicia printing was a very successful one. Now, when Hasidim do something religious, they do it right. I have here, by the way, if you see, It's a beautiful Talmud, Brachot, Talmud Bavli. Where is it printed? Where is it printed? In Slavicia. We'll go ahead and just show you to be sure that you see it. Slavicia. That's the printing of Slavicia. Now, by the way, this printing of Slavicia was done with beauty, with precision. The printing of Slavicia, according to some records, some documents I read once, they even took the movable typeset and put it in the mikveh beforehand, because they were Hasidim and they wanted everything to be done b'kedusha v'tahara. But the fact is, I personally sometimes feel that Hasidim do a better job when it comes to religious items, or it comes to religious practices, because sometimes you take a Lithuanian shaykhet, right? You take a shaykhet that went through a yeshiva. So he wakes up in the morning to be a shaykhet, and he says to himself, "Oy, what a pain. I wish I would be in Koil sitting in yeshiva and studying Torah." So he doesn't do it with enthusiasm, and the odds of a mistake are greater when you do things without excitement. The Hasidic Yidda wakes up in the morning at 5 or 4 a.m. to be a shaykhet. He says to himself, "Oh, I'm going to go ahead and take out the nitzotzos, take out the holy sparks from that animal." And he starts giving Kabbalistic insight to what he is doing. He does it with enthusiasm. So in general, they do a better job. And this is from a Litvak. Now, the Slavicia printing was a beautiful print, very, very popular. And they continued. So if you would walk into your local Eiger, right, in Warsaw, in 1812, 1813, 1814, and wanted to buy a Talmud, number one, you were rich, and number two, you would be getting your Slavicia Talmud, okay? So remember that. Now, what happens is that we reach the year 1834, and you walk into your local bookstore, and you want to buy a Shas. No Slavicia Shasin were available. They simply were not available. Think about it. You couldn't buy it. They would have individual Shabbos, maybe individual brachas, meaning individual tractates they did have, but they did not have a complete set of Talmud. So now in Vilna, there's a family called the Rom family. When the Rom family finds out that there are no longer any complete Talmuds, they start turning to rabbis. And they ask for a haskama, or really what they are asking for is to lock up the market for them to start a Vilna printing. There was already printing in Vilna taking place, but a Shas, to print the Shas, the whole Talmud, and the investment involved was a new project. So this is taking place in 1834. So they go to great rabbis, and among the rabbis who gave a green light to the Vilna printers to begin the process of printing their Shas was Rabbi Akiva Eiger. Now, when Slavicia got wind of it, they were unhappy because they claimed, wait a second, we still have some individual copies. We can't sell them unless we start printing the ones that are missing. So therefore, the marketplace still belongs to us. And they even were able to show that a few of the rabbis in 1807 gave them 25 years. So they believe that they have the market until 1830, I think it would be like 7 years, whatever it was an extension of the market that would work. Maybe it was from 1817 to 1842, whatever it was, they had a belief that they still had complete control of the market. So Rabbi Akiva Eiger came up with a compromise that Vilna would be the one to print. However, if there are individual tractates of the Talmud that Slavicia cannot sell, Vilna should take it upon themselves to purchase it from them. So therefore, Slavicia will not have a loss. So that seems fair, but Slavicia was not satisfied with it. And Slavicia decided to start their own printing, meaning if you would walk into a printing house in Slavicia early 1835, you would see them actually printing a whole Talmud. And at the same time, it was done in Vilna, which was problematic because, the market perhaps cannot sustain both. Some believed it could, but they seem to be violating what Rabbi Akiva Eiger said. Now, when a few rabbis approached the Slavicia printers, They claimed that the only reason Rabbi Akiva Eiger gave a green light to Vilna was because his son Shlomo Eiger was bribed by the Vilna printers, meaning they made a statement, which is quite problematic, that the decision made by Rabbi Akiva Eiger was not based purely on halacha, but there's some untruthfulness that's taking place. And they called Shlomo Eiger a name, Ben Koziva. Ben Koziva. Ben Koziva means like the one who is Kozev, the untruthful son. And there was a hint there also, because if you know a little bit of history of the Bar Kokhba rebellion, and the name of Bar Kokhba was Bar Koziva, and who was the rabbi that supported Bar Kokhba? Rabbi Akiva. So they were trying to hint there to something that appeared to be extremely inappropriate. And it's interesting that a letter, it's hard to see it here, but in this letter, Rabbi Akiva Eiger writes that he was extremely upset that people are claiming that my son, that Bni Gaon Itale Vavi, what kind of chutzpah can they say such a thing? And he was extremely upset at the printers of Slavitsia. And he ends off by saying, Eineni mochel lahem adavar klal v'klal. I do not forgive them. He was extremely upset at Slavitsia printers. And he writes, because even though I personally don't care about insults, mitzidi einei makpid, I don't care so much. Aval al bizyona Torah, this is a shame of Torah. In other words, if a rabbinic authority gives a psak based on facts, if people are going to start questioning it and claiming that there's corruption, it's going to destroy the system. And this is a shame of Torah. Rabbi Akiva Eiger said this is unacceptable. And therefore, I say I'm not mochel them, I do not forgive them. Now, there's a sad ending to the Slavitsia printing, perhaps some other time that they got caught. What happened was, briefly, that the Slavitsia printers were in a great rush to complete their project. And one day, one of the workers committed suicide there and hung himself at the workplace. The printers knew that if they call authorities, they're going to shut down the operation for some time. So therefore, they decided to cover it up. They just buried him and bribed the family a little bit. And obviously, the cover-up is always worse than the actual action. And you can ask Richard Nixon if you want to verify that. So as a result, the government found out and they sent the brothers, the printers, to Siberia, and they got punished. They're a terrible ending to Slavitsia printing. And as a result of that, the printing hub for Talmudic literature became Vilna. And on a side note, if you see, I'll show you again the picture here, that this woman that you see here, her name is Dvorah Rum. Dvorah Rum. And I think every yeshiva student should know about Dvorah Rum, because in the 1860s, this is decades after the passing of Rabbi Akiva Eiger, she took charge of the printing house. And she was married to a Rum. She lost her husband at a young age, and she was a very sharp businesswoman. And the fact that today on every bookshelf you'll find the Talmud based on the Vilna edition is because of her initiative in the late 1870s, early 1880s. So the popularity of the Vilna Shas is because of Dvorah Rum. Very, very interesting story there. But Rabbi Akiva Eiger's involvement in the issue was one that it was a level of tragedy, but a very strong position he took. One more brief story about his life. You know, when we study Mishnah, we often use the commentator Tiferet Israel by a rabbi by the name of Israel Lifshitz. As if, you know, when we had summertime Pirkei Avot upstairs, every Shabbos I think I would quote something from Tiferet Israel, Rabbi Lifshitz. Now, Rabbi Lifshitz had a son. I didn't know anything about the son, but what I would note when I would study Tiferet Israel is that sometimes there was, in his commentary, things that were printed in a smaller font, and at the end, 3 letters would appear: Aleph, Bet, Yud. And I didn't know what the Aleph, Bet, Yud was. So after a little bit of research, I found out that the Aleph, Bet, Yud stands for Amar Baruch Yitzchak. Amar Baruch Yitzchak. So it appears Rabbi Lifshitz had a son by the name of Baruch Yitzchak. Baruch Yitzchak was the one that published the works of his father, Rabbi Israel. There were times that he felt that he wants to add something. So therefore, in parentheses, in a smaller font, he would share his insights. And to indicate that it's not from the father, he would put the Aleph, Bet, Yud. That's the Amar Baruch Yitzchak. Now, Baruch Yitzchak was known as being a little bit more liberal. And in some Hasidic circles, they didn't like him. Tiferes Yisrael himself, there are some things that are controversial. For example, he is one that suggests that perhaps the universe is a little bit older than 6,000 years, which created some level of controversy. And Baruch Yitzchak seems to be, he was the one that got the brunt from Hasidic circles for some sayings of the father. And like there was one Hasidic Rebbe that used to say that it's hard to read the insights of Baruch Yitzchak because small letters could hurt the sight. So on the surface, that's a statement that has to do with the small font, but he was referring to the idea that perhaps in Ashkafa in the Hasidic world, what Baruch Yitzchak has to say is problematic. Anyway, how does this relate to Rabbi Akiva Eiger? When Baruch Yitzchak was in his early 20s, he was single, and he was offered a rabbinic position not far from Posen. When Rabbi Akiva Eiger found out that a bocher, a non-married person, is considering a position in the rabbinate, he said this is unacceptable. And he wrote a letter to the father and said, Rabbi Yisrael, I do not want your son getting that position. It seems to be that he was ignored because we find more letters after that where Rabbi Akiva Eiger is writing to the shochtim in that town and telling them, don't take the authority of Baruch Yitzchak. He is a bocher. A bocher should not be a rabbi. And he fought against him. I'm not sure why. It could be that Rabbi Akiva Eiger understood that we're in an era that the rabbi is not just someone sitting in an office, but the rabbi is someone that interacts with people, communicates with people, and therefore a single individual perhaps could create some issues. And there's no doubt in anyone's mind that if you could decrease the odd of inappropriate behavior, of course you have the responsibility of doing so. And a single rabbi would be a problem. Very interesting discussion indeed. Now, Rabbi Akiva Eiger was in an era where there's already change taking place. And he had to deal at his old age of Jews who Friday night would go to shul, but afterwards would go to the theater. This is Germany. This is Germany in the 1830s. So when Rabbi Akiva Eiger was a very old man, someone approached him and told him that there are Jews that go from shul to the theater. And Rabbi Akiva Eiger cried out, "Oy, such ganovim, such crooks." So they thought he's losing a mind. What do you mean, Rabbi? So he said, I'll tell you the following. There's the statement in the Talmud that when a person goes to shul Friday night, there are 2 angels that walk with him home. That's what we are told. And when the angels come and see that there's a Shabbos table and Shabbos candles and challahs, they give him a blessing. So now, says Rabbi Akiva Eiger, this fellow leaves shul. He's going with 2 angels, goes to the theater box office. He purchases only 1 ticket, and the 2 angels walk in with him, and he doesn't pay for them. They're ganovim for going to the theater and not paying for the 2 angels. That was the humor that he did have. I'll end up sharing with you his will, his tzava, the tzava of Rabbi Akiva Eiger, and probably a lesson that's relevant to all of us. He wrote the following, that Bishat HaLevaya, at the time of the Levaya, Yechulku la'aniim, they should give out to the poor people, matbeot, coins, kesev of silver, keminyan, the numerical value of Akiva. Okay, that's what he felt would benefit his soul, to give to the poor from his money, silver coins. How many? The corresponding to the name Akiva. Very interesting. I always wonder if a fellow, his name is Gad, right? And the numerical value is 7. If he has to give 7, and if another fellow, his name is Tachura, and his numerical value is at 900, I just remember. But in any event, this is something, Rabbi Akiva Eiger, what is relevant, what we could take from it is the importance of tzedakah. Another statement of Rabbi Akiva Eiger that we find in his will, it's printed. He writes the following, that his children should not fast on the yahrzeit. No fasting on the yahrzeit. What they should do is create a learning cycle that for the 24 hours of the yahrzeit, someone should be studying Torah. And if it cannot be a descendant, they should hire someone. But they should create a 24-hour cycle of limud Torah for every single yahrzeit. This is what Rabbi Akiva Eiger said. So I think the lessons here are lessons of tzedakah, of Torah, and it's a rabbi of commitment. It was a rabbi in the marketplace. He was extremely involved in all aspects, and hopefully we get a little bit of a taste. He passed away in 1837. His influence is such that just as on my shelf here, I have several works of Rabbi Akiva Eiger, his responses and his Torah, and in every page of Talmud, there are insights of his printed. So too, I hope we could benefit from this very committed individual. It's an opportunity, again, to thank our two sponsors. Thank you, Zuck family. Thank you, Shirley, Neshama should have an Aliyah. And thank you, Fagi Libman also. May the Neshama have an Aliyah. And I thank you, everyone. I thank all of you for joining us tonight. Be'ezrat Hashem, we'll have a shir Monday morning. No shir next Thursday night. But hopefully we could continue after that. Okay, good.